Her mother had been the kind of woman whose presence filled a room before she even spoke. Villagers used to say that she carried a hidden ember in her chest, for wherever she walked, warmth followed. Her laugh was remembered long after her passing, a low, rippling sound that seemed to loosen the winter's grip. When she entered a cottage, the hearth would brighten, as though flames leapt higher in her honor. Some called it charm, others called it blessing, and a few muttered darker words beneath their breath, wondering whether such a gift came from heaven or from something far more dangerous. In those days, her father had walked proudly at her side, his face softened by love, his hands less burdened by the toil of field and frost. They lived in a small house at the edge of the village, where smoke rose faithfully from their chimney and the hearth never once failed them. When the girl was born, she was cradled into that warmth. Neighbors visited with gifts of bread and wool, remarking on her bright eyes and delicate features, but more than one guest noticed how the candle flames bent toward the infant as though in greeting. The women whispered on the way home, whispering in tones not quite disapproval, not quite awe. Her mother's life ended too soon, in a way that left more questions than answers. Some said she caught fever from tending the sick. Others whispered that the fire she had carried so effortlessly finally turned on her. The truth was simple and cruel. One night she lay down, coughing, her skin pale and damp, and by morning she was gone. The hearth did not flicker as she passed, nor did any heavenly sign appear, only silence, and a girl left motherless. Her father was not the same afterward. His back bent heavier under grief, his voice grew sharp at the edges, and his eyes seemed always searching for what had been taken. He tried to keep the home as it had been, but the hearth no longer burned with easy constancy. Sometimes it smoked, sometimes it burned too low, and always he muttered that something was missing. The villagers watched, shaking their heads, and their whispers about the girl grew louder. They said she had inherited her mother's blessing, or curse. They said the fire bent toward her the same way it had to the dead woman. And though she was still a child, she began to feel the weight of suspicion in every glance. Years passed, and her father, hollowed by loneliness, took another wife. She was a widow from a neighboring village, plain-faced but sharp-eyed, eager for stability. To him she seemed a balm, a chance to patch the rent fabric of his life. To the girl, she was a stranger who smelled of cold earth and carried a smile too tight to be comforting. At first, the stepmother was polite, even gentle, but soon her eyes lingered on the girl with unease. She noticed how the flames seemed restless when the child sat too near, how the hearth popped and hissed as though speaking. She began to make excuses to send the girl outside, muttering that she had too much wildness in her blood. The jealousy did not show itself in open words, not yet. It appeared in subtle ways, a hand lingering too long on the father's arm when the girl tried to speak, a sharp glance when neighbors remarked on the child's beauty. The stepmother had come to the valley seeking a quiet life, a place where order and propriety kept fear at bay. But here was a girl who seemed to stir flames without touching them, who carried in her face the memory of another woman, a woman praised for her warmth, remembered with aching fondness. It was as though the girl herself was a mirror, reflecting what the stepmother could never be. Her father, too weary to notice, welcomed the surface calm. He believed his new wife steadied the home, and he turned his eyes away when shadows passed between girl and woman. He told himself that grief had been buried, that balance was returning. But beneath the surface, whispers thickened in the air, and the first sparks of envy glowed like coals waiting to be stirred into flame. It began with small things, so slight that an outsider might not have noticed them at all. A portion of bread withheld from her plate, the thickest blanket kept folded in the chest when the nights turned raw. When she asked about it, the stepmother would smile a thin smile and say, "You are young, you can endure the chill." Her father never questioned it, his gaze already sliding elsewhere, as though it pained him to look too closely. The girl learned to chew her meager scraps slowly, to fold her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, and to keep silent. Silence, she thought, was the only defense left to her. But silence could not hide the glances. Whenever she passed through the room, the stepmother's eyes followed, hard as flint. At the well, the woman bent close to neighbors and muttered words the girl could not hear, though she felt their sting when she caught the shifting looks from the other villagers. She heard the word unnatural more than once, carried on a hiss of gossip, and it clung to her like smoke. Children her age began to draw back when she joined their games, muttering excuses, tugged away by mothers who did not meet her eyes. The hearth itself seemed to echo the tension. Where once the fire had burned bright, warming every corner, it now faltered. Flames bent strangely, hissing when the girl sat too near. Sometimes, when she entered, the fire sputtered and shrank, as if retreating from her presence, only to flare again when she rose to leave. Candles flickered violently in her hands, dripping wax onto the floor as though they feared her touch. Once, during supper, the lamp above the table went out with a sudden gasp of smoke, leaving the family in darkness until her father relit it with unsteady hands. No one spoke during the meal, but the stepmother's satisfied smirk glowed more brightly than any flame. Her father had grown quieter since his remarriage, a man hollowed by grief and dulled by guilt. At first he tried to shield his daughter from unkindness, patting her shoulder, speaking gentle words. But over time the stepmother's whispers worked their way into him. She planted seeds of doubt. "The girl makes the fire restless," she would murmur, "you know how dangerous that can be." When he resisted, she would sigh, her hand lingering on his, her eyes glistening as if with tears. "I only want our house to be safe." And so he turned away more often, until his silence became another weapon laid against the child. Nights grew colder. Once, the girl awoke to find the fire gone entirely, the hearth reduced to grey ash. She curled into herself, shivering, while her stepmother slept soundly beside her father, their room sealed warm against the night. The girl whispered to the shadows, begging the fire to return, but only silence answered. In the morning, the stepmother scolded her for failing to keep the hearth alive, though she had been forbidden from tending it at all. "Even fire refuses your care," she said with a sharp laugh. Her father stood nearby, his face pale, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any rebuke. As weeks turned to months, the girl carried the weight of eyes always on her, suspicion hanging like frost in the air. The villagers whispered more boldly now, their fear growing as tales spread of candles sputtering and flames bending near her. Some swore they saw sparks follow her in the dusk, as though embers clung to her steps. The stepmother nurtured each rumor, feeding them like dry twigs into kindling, her envy glowing hot beneath her measured words. The girl felt it building, a pressure beneath the surface of her days, like smoke thickening before a blaze. Each act of cruelty, each cold glance, each extinguished flame pressed her toward an unseen edge. She did not know when or how, but she sensed that the world around her was winding tighter, preparing to snap. One day the village would demand more than whispers. One day she would be forced into a trial she could not escape. And in that moment, she feared, it would not be silence but fire itself that spoke on her behalf. The whispers that had haunted her since childhood finally found their shape in the stepmother's mouth. It began at the market, where women gathered close for warmth as they exchanged bread and gossip. "Fires don't misbehave for no reason," the stepmother said softly, almost kindly, as though reluctant to voice such thoughts. "When she enters a room, the flames shudder. Surely you've seen it yourselves." The women nodded, muttering their unease. From there, the rumor spread like sparks in dry grass, catching on the tongues of men who feared ill luck in their homes, of elders who remembered the old stories where fire and witchcraft walked hand in hand. By the time snow gathered thick along the eaves, the village had made up its mind. It was decided not with shouts but with the grim murmurs of people who believed themselves righteous. The girl would be shut away in the abandoned hut at the edge of the woods, the one long left to rot after fever had claimed its last tenant. There, without fire, she would be tested. If she was pure, she would endure as others had before her. If she was cursed, the cold would reveal it. No one said the word which aloud, but the weight of it hung in every glance cast her way. Her father did not argue. Perhaps he wanted to, his hands trembled when they bound her wrists loosely, as though every knot choked him. But the stepmother's voice wove around his silence, urging, coaxing, painting this exile as mercy. "It is only for a night or two," she whispered. "If she returns unharmed, all doubt will vanish." And so, bound by guilt and fear, he let them lead his daughter into the snow. The hut squatted like a carcass at the tree line, its walls bowed with age, its roof sagging under the weight of frost. When the door closed behind her, the darkness pressed in like a hand. The smell of rot and dust filled her lungs. She stood shivering, her thin shawl no shield against the icy air, and listened as the bolt scraped shut. Footsteps retreated, leaving her in silence so profound she could hear her own pulse. Cold claimed her quickly. It bit her fingers and toes, gnawed at her ears, crawled down her spine. She curled into herself, tucking her knees against her chest, but the chill seeped through cloth and skin as though her body were nothing but sieve. She thought of the hearth at home, its flames hissing and snapping, and the memory only deepened her despair. Hours stretched. The only sounds were her teeth chattering and the occasional groan of wood in the rafters. She whispered prayers into the void, words she had learned from her mother before memory itself began to blur. She begged for warmth, for deliverance, for proof that she was not forsaken. Each prayer hung in the air like smoke without flame, unanswered, and each moment of silence pressed heavy on her chest. She thought of the villagers, their suspicious stares, their mutters of unnatural. She thought of her stepmother, lips curved in a smile that never touched her eyes. She thought of her father, head bowed, unable to meet her gaze. No one would open the door for her. No one would bring a spark to light even a single candle. Alone, she was left to freeze, not as punishment, but as judgment. Her body weakened. Shivers grew violent, then dulled into a hollow ache as the cold sank deeper. Her breath came thin and shallow, little clouds that rose and vanished. She pressed her hands together, as if she might squeeze warmth out of her own skin, but her palms were ice. When her lips moved again, the words came not as pleas but as farewell. She accepted what the night demanded, that she would die here, nameless and unwanted, her bones left to rattle in a hut no one dared approach. Tears would not come, they froze on her lashes. Her eyes closed, heavy with surrender. For the first time, she let despair wash over her without resistance. If there was a spark left in her at all, it was too small to fight against the winter pressing in from every side. She whispered one last time, barely moving her lips, "Mother, if you see me, take me with you." Then she let silence answer, the silence of the grave, and waited for the cold to finish its work. At first, there was nothing but cold, an endless gnawing that chewed at her bones, sinking deeper until even thought felt frozen. She had stopped shivering hours before, her body too exhausted to fight. The silence inside the hut was so complete that it seemed to press against her ears, punctuated only by the brittle creak of the rafters overhead. Her breath rose weakly in the air, thin threads of mist unraveling into nothing. She had whispered her last prayer and thought no answer would come. But then, faintly, she felt it, a tremor in the stillness, as if the air itself shifted. At first she thought it was her imagination, the last flicker of her mind before death. Yet soon, a warmth stirred, subtle but undeniable. It wrapped around her like the memory of a blanket long taken from her shoulders. She gasped, her eyes flying open. Before her, the air shimmered faintly, sparks glimmering as though someone had scattered embers into the gloom. They floated without smoke or ash, pulsing gently, alive yet fragile. She reached out with a trembling hand, certain they would vanish at her touch, but instead they swirled closer, hovering just above her skin. Heat radiated from them, gentle, comforting, not the wild bite of a blaze. She pressed her palms together, and the sparks flickered brighter, as if in response. A sob escaped her lips, half relief, half disbelief. The sparks grew, multiplying, until threads of flame unwound themselves from the air. They were not bound to wood or straw, they sprang from nothing, curling upward in bright ribbons. They did not devour the rotting timbers of the hut, nor the rags beneath her body. Instead, they circled her, rising and falling like dancers in rhythm to a music she could not hear. She turned slowly, her eyes wide, unable to comprehend. Fire had always meant danger, destruction, but here it was different. Here it seemed alive, purposeful. Or warred with terror in her chest. Was this salvation, or proof of the curse her stepmother had whispered about for so long? She thought of the village's stairs, the muttered word unnatural, and a tremor ran through her body. But the flames only twined closer, casting their glow across her cheeks, their warmth seeping through her thin shawl. She realized then that her limbs no longer ached with the sharp teeth of frost. The numbness receded, replaced by steady heat. The fire was shielding her, guarding her from the cold that had nearly claimed her life. Tears welled in her eyes, but they did not freeze this time. They rolled warm down her cheeks, glinting in the orange light. She pressed her hands against her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady for the first time since she had been shut in. The flames rose higher, forming an arc above her head, not wild or uncontrolled but circling like sentinels. She whispered her mother's name, wondering if somehow this was her doing, if the fire had always belonged to her family. The longer she watched, the less fear she felt. The flames bent as though listening, leaning close when she breathed, retreating slightly when she recoiled. They were not mindless, not hungry, they seemed aware, like creatures called forth from the heart of the world. She dared to move, stretching out her hand, and one flame slipped free from the circle to hover just above her palm. It glowed there like a living jewel, radiant and impossibly delicate. She wanted to close her fingers around it, to keep it forever, but instinct told her not to. So she let it hover, trembling with light, until it drifted back to the others. The hut, once suffocating with its silence and cold, now glowed like a sacred place. The crumbling walls flickered with shadows, the roof beams bathed in gold. The girl sat straighter, her eyes shining with reflected fire. Somewhere deep inside, a truth settled over her: she had not been abandoned. She had not been left to die. The flames had come for her, not as an accident, but as a sign. Yet all was tangled with dread. What did this mean? If the villagers saw, would they fall to their knees in worship, or drag her to the pyre in terror? The stepmother's face rose in her mind, twisted with envy and rage, and she knew the woman would call this proof of wickedness. Still, the flames circled faithfully, whispering in crackles and pops too soft to understand, wrapping her in their presence as though to say, "You are not alone. You were never alone." She pressed her forehead to her knees, sobs shaking her shoulders, and let the warmth cradle her. Fear and wonder braided together, heavy and dazzling, and in the dark heart of winter she understood. The trial had begun, and fire itself had chosen its side. At first, the village kept its distance. The decree had been spoken, and none wished to be seen breaking the judgment they had agreed upon. But curiosity gnawed at them like hunger, and fear sharpened it. By the third day, when no one had yet emerged from the hut, whispers began to stir. "Has she frozen?" some asked in hushed tones. "Or has the cold revealed her for what she truly is?" Eyes darted toward the woods where the hut crouched beneath snow and shadow, and though no one admitted it aloud, they longed to know whether the girl lay stiff as ice inside or whether something darker kept her alive. So, beneath the veil of dusk, a few slipped away from the safety of the hearth. They trudged across the frozen fields, their breath rising in clouds, their hearts pounding with dread and anticipation. The trees loomed, skeletal and still, and the hut came into view, its roof heavy with frost, its windows black hollows. At first they saw nothing unusual, just silence, just the brittle crack of branches beneath their boots. One man dared creep closer, pressing his face to a crack in the wood. What he saw made him stumble back with a cry that silenced the others. Inside, flames moved. Not the steady burn of a hearth fire, nor the wild blaze of destruction, but a circling, living dance of light. They swirled around the girl where she sat curled on the floor, her head bowed as if in prayer. The flames bent and twined, licking the air but never consuming the timber of the hut, never touching her skin. They shone brighter than any torch, yet cast no smoke, no smell of ash. Her breath rose in mist, and yet she was not shivering. It was as though the fire itself had chosen her, wrapping her in a cloak of light. A gasp went through the small crowd, and one woman fell to her knees, crossing herself and whispering words of repentance. Another man staggered back, his voice hoarse. "Witchcraft, she summons fire like a demon." The villagers turned upon each other, their fears spilling out in contradictions. Some muttered prayers, others curses, but none could deny what they had seen. Fire was life, fire was death, and here it moved at her command, or in her defense. Word spread swiftly. By dawn, half the village was murmuring of the sight. Some spoke in awe, saying the girl was blessed, a vessel chosen by heaven to guard against the cruelty of winter. Others spat and called it blasphemy, claiming no holy power could twist fire into such obedience. The elders gathered in anxious council, their voices tight with fear of what might come if the flames turned against them. The stepmother's rage burned hotter than any flame that had shielded the girl. She had hoped for a body frozen stiff, proof of impurity that would bury the girl's memory once and for all. Instead, she was faced with a miracle, or a nightmare, that placed the girl at the center of every whisper in the village. No longer did suspicion cling only to the stepmother's carefully sown rumors, now the people had seen with their own eyes. And what they saw terrified them. She stormed through the village, her voice slicing the air. "Do you not see? This is no blessing, it is curse. Fire bends to her because she is unnatural, a danger to us all. Will you wait until our fields are ash, until our homes burn with her fury? Will you risk your children's lives on her silence?" Her words cut deep, feeding the villagers' dread. Some nodded, clutching their cloaks tighter as though expecting the flames to leap from the woods and swallow them whole. Yet not all were swayed. A few, shaken by the sight of the girl unharmed within her fiery cocoon, whispered of divine protection, of justice turned against cruelty. But those voices were thin, fragile reeds against the rising storm of fear and envy. The girl, within the hut, knew nothing of the battle her existence was stirring beyond the walls. She only felt the fire's hum, steady and strange, like a heartbeat that was not her own. The flames circled closer, not burning, only watching, as though they too waited for what would come next. The stepmother's fury had been smoldering for days, fed by the whispers of the villagers and the sight of fire bending to the girl's will. Each rumor she overheard, each murmur of awe or terror, was like oil poured upon her envy. She had once believed exile would silence the child forever, that the cold would bury her beneath snow and memory. Instead, the girl had emerged wrapped in fire itself, and now the village teetered between reverence and fear. For the stepmother, there was no choice left. If she could not turn them all against the girl with words, then she would finish it with her own hands. It happened in the square, where villagers gathered to argue over what the girl's fire meant. Some shouted for her banishment, others trembled and muttered of miracles, and all eyes turned to the girl as she stood with flames glimmering faintly about her like a crown. The stepmother pushed forward, her voice shrill above the crowd. "This is no blessing, it is witchcraft. You cower before her because you are blind, but I will prove the truth." Her face was twisted, red with hatred, her hands curled like claws. Before anyone could stop her, she lunged. Her fingers stretched for the girl's throat, her eyes blazing with triumph, as if this act would finally strip away the fire's mystery and show her for what she was. The girl froze, too stunned to move, too horrified to resist the woman who had stolen her childhood. But the flames did not hesitate. With a roar like wind in a furnace, they surged outward. Fire burst from the air around the girl, striking the stepmother in a torrent of light. She screamed, a sound that pierced the marrow of everyone who heard it. Flames clung to her as though alive, racing across her body. Some swore later that the fire did not touch her clothing at first, but her very skin, burning from within. Others said her garments went up like dry kindling, the blaze leaping skyward. Whatever the truth, there was no mistaking the terror of that moment. The stepmother writhing in fire, her face twisted in agony, her voice breaking into hoarse shrieks that echoed against the walls of the square. The villagers stumbled back in horror. A few fell to their knees, calling the girl saint, chosen by the heavens. Others cried out witch, and covered their eyes as though afraid to be blinded. The girl herself could not move, could not breathe, as she watched the fire she had trusted turn savage. She had not willed it, yet it obeyed some deeper law, striking down the hand raised against her. Her heart hammered, torn between relief and terror, between justice and cruelty. When the flames withdrew, the stepmother collapsed to the ground. She was not entirely consumed, her body still lay there, twitching faintly, but she was changed beyond recognition. Her skin was blackened, cracked like charred wood, her hair nothing but ash drifting in the wind. Whether she still breathed was uncertain, but the sight alone was enough to silence every voice in the square. The woman who had plotted and whispered and struck had been undone not by blade or rope but by the very fire she had sought to condemn. The girl's father staggered forward, his face ashen. He dropped to his knees beside the smoldering figure, his hands trembling as he reached out but could not bring himself to touch. His eyes lifted then to his daughter, and in them was not accusation, not even fear, but a hollow grief deeper than words. Shame carved his features, the shame of a man who had stood silent too long, who had let cruelty fester in his home until it ended in ruin. His mouth opened, but no words came, only a strangled sob that broke him to the ground. The girl felt the flames flicker around her, waiting, as though listening for her command. But she had no command to give. She stared at her father's crumpled form, at the charred ruin of the woman who had hated her, and felt the weight of both awe and despair press into her chest. The fire had protected her, but its protection was a blade as sharp as any knife. She wondered then if it was blessing or curse, miracle or judgment. The square remained silent but for the crackle of dying embers. Every villager knew they had witnessed something that would haunt them all their lives. The silence in the square lingered long after the flames had retreated, heavy and suffocating. No one stepped closer to her, though all eyes followed her every movement. Some gazes trembled with awe, others with hatred, but all held the same truth: she could not stay. Whether they whispered of miracle or curse, the villagers feared the fire that bent to her will, feared what it might mean if she remained among them. Her father did not speak. He stayed on his knees beside the blackened ruin of his wife, his shoulders bowed beneath grief and shame. Once, he might have begged her to stay, but now his silence said more than words could. He could not defend her, could not claim her, not after all he had allowed to happen. She watched him for a long moment, hoping for even a flicker of love, of apology, of recognition. But there was nothing, only a man hollowed out by his own failures. So she turned away. The villagers parted, hesitant, as though afraid the hem of her dress might scorch them. The flames followed her, glimmering faintly in the air, trailing like lanterns in the dusk. They lit her steps as she walked from the square, out of the village she had once called home. The snow caught their glow, scattering it in sparks across the ground, and behind her the people murmured, their voices rising like wind through bare branches. Some wept, some cursed, but none reached for her. The path beyond the village stretched into shadow, the forest looming with its ancient silence. She paused at the edge, turning once to look back. The rooftops sagged under snow, the chimney sent up smoke, and every window glowed with firelight she could never share again. It struck her then with terrible clarity: she had always been set apart, always destined to walk a road different from theirs. The hearth had never been hers, The warmth she carried was not meant for a single home but for something larger, something she could not yet see. Tears blurred her vision, but she did not wipe them away. She let them fall, each drop warm against her cold skin, proof that she was still human, still capable of sorrow. "Goodbye," she whispered, though no one was near enough to hear. It was not only farewell to the village but to the child she had been, the one who longed for her father's smile, for her mother's hearth, for belonging. The flames pressed closer, as though urging her forward. They flickered in patterns she almost thought she could understand, like voices just beyond hearing. She drew her shawl tighter, lifted her chin, and stepped into the trees. The darkness did not frighten her, the fire lit the way, scattering the shadows before her, weaving a path through the unknown. For the first time, the world beyond the village was not a void but a promise. And though sorrow clung to her, so too did freedom. The flames did not bind her, they walked with her, guardians and companions, whispering of a destiny waiting to be claimed. The village crouched between the hills like a secret that wished never to be spoken aloud. Its roofs were thatched low against the wind, its chimneys always thinly smoking, for fire was the heart of survival in that cold valley. Every home had its hearth, every family tended flame with near religious devotion, and woe to the one who let it die out. Fire was purity, fire was life, fire was the only barrier against the long winters that could swallow the land whole. Yet, like all things sacred, it was also feared. The villagers whispered that fire could be fickle, that it bent to moods and omens, and that if treated carelessly it would turn its back on them. In such a place, superstition was not an idle pastime but the thread that stitched survival together. Children were taught not to laugh too loudly near the hearth, lest sparks leap out in anger. Women spat into flames to seal oaths, men cut kindling in silence so as not to stir its wrath. A crooked flame, a sudden gust that snuffed a candle, these were read like signs in the stars. Nothing was dismissed as chance, and everything bore the weight of hidden meaning. It was no wonder, then, that when a child was born and the fires of her household began to flicker strangely, the village marked her as different. The girl was no older than 5 when neighbors began to notice. A candle would gutter when she entered a room, then flare higher once she left. Sparks leapt from kindling as though eager when she leaned close. Once, during a festival, she passed by the bonfire and the flames bent toward her as though bowing in greeting. People gasped, some crossing themselves, others muttering prayers under their breath. From that night forward, rumors followed her like shadows. "They say she unsettles the hearth," old women hissed as they drew cloaks tighter around their shoulders. "A flame is meant to burn steady. Around her, it dances like a thing alive." Children dared each other to stand near her door, then fled shrieking when the light inside flared unnaturally bright. Even her playmates began to keep their distance, casting wary looks over their shoulders as though expecting the air itself to ignite. Her father tried to hush the whispers, claiming coincidence, claiming the people had too much wine in their heads. But the village thrived on fear as much as it did on bread, and fear spread faster than truth. It seeped into every corner until even the sound of her footsteps seemed to draw suspicion. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a sense of inevitability. Some believed she was marked, touched by a force older than the valley itself. Others muttered that nothing good could come from a child who drew fire's favor. In a place where survival depended on keeping flames obedient, a girl who stirred them into strange dances was a danger. No one said it aloud, not yet, but the thought simmered beneath every whispered rumor, every wary glance. If the fire chose her, then the village might one day be forced to choose against her. For when fire shifts from servant to master, there can be no peace. Years slipped into decades, and the girl's name was slowly swallowed by time, but her story was not. Around the hearths of the village that had once cast her out, people began to speak of her in hushed voices, weaving her life into something larger than memory. Children grew up hearing warnings and wonders alike, of the maiden who walked into the forest with fire at her heels, of the hut where flames had danced without smoke, of the night when envy was burned away in shrieks that echoed still in the bones of the earth. Some said she had perished in the wilderness, her body taken by wolves or by frost. Yet when wildfires swept across the valleys in later years, leaping from tree to tree with a fury no rain could tame, the old ones whispered that it was her spirit, restless and wandering, testing the world with the power that had once shielded her. The flame-bound maiden walks still, they told their grandchildren, and if you hear crackling in the woods when no hearth is near, turn back, for she may be watching. Others swore she had not died but ascended, finding a place where she could wield her gift without fear. They told of a distant land where a queen sat on a throne of black stone, her crown a circlet of living fire that never dimmed. In her courts, they said, warmth never failed, and her people thrived beneath the eternal glow of her protection. Yet even those who told that tale lowered their voices, for they could not decide if such power made her a savior or a tyrant. A queen crowned with flame was no ordinary ruler, she was something more, and something less. In every telling, the question lingered, had she been blessed, chosen by the heavens to bear fire's guardianship? Or had she been cursed, condemned to walk apart from humankind, her gift forever a burden? The villagers who remembered her silence, her sorrowful eyes, leaned toward pity. Those who recalled the stepmother's screams muttered of divine judgment. And so the legend remained suspended, neither wholly bright nor wholly dark, like a fire that warms and destroys in the same breath. Yet one image endured, unchanging through all the stories. A maiden, young and solemn, walking into the wilderness while snow fell softly around her. No torch in her hand, no cloak upon her shoulders, yet flames circled her in silence, flickering, watching, faithful as hounds at her heels. They lit the path into shadow, their glow never fading, and she walked on without turning back. Some claimed they saw her still, far from the village, when night pressed deepest and sparks danced above the treetops. They swore she was neither spirit nor queen but something in between, bound forever to the fire that had saved and damned her. And so she lived on, not in flesh but in story, the flame-bound maiden, eternal and untouchable, her guardian circling in the dark.